Happy weekend, everyone. Josh's Severe Weather. I hope you all are doing great. We're going to talk about my updates to the Atlantic hurricane season forecast. And this is a super tricky season to try to pin down. I'm going to share my screen with you. And honestly, we have not really seen, at least in modern history, a season where the ingredients have varied so much. This is going to be an unprecedented hurricane season and one that I think we need to be prepared for. Typically speaking, we're heading towards an El Nino. Typically, that cuts down on the number of storms. It increases wind shear in the Atlantic basin. There are other factors in play, though, that I think are going to not only counter that, but maybe just kind of rewrite history here this season. So I hope I'm wrong, but I want you all to be prepared just in case. Forecasts can change on a dime. We can see climate patterns change. I'm not getting into climate change and all that, but let's just say things are not what they used to be. How's that sound? So it's time to prepare ourselves for what could be an unprecedented hurricane season. Not going to scare you guys, just want you to be prepared at this point. Here's the list of named storms. We've already had Arlene. In theory, we've had a storm before this. I believe we may have actually had two storms before this, but we will see at the end of the season how the National Hurricane Center designates those storms. But nonetheless, this is the list of names here. And I don't think we're going to get all the way to Whitney, but we'll have to take a look at that. But we do have new names on this list. That we had 2017 where some storm names were retired. And new names like Harold and Idalia are on the list here, as well as Margot and Nigel. So definitely have to be getting ready and gearing up for what could be a pretty busy season here. Here from tropicaltidbits.com is the ONI. It's the Oceanic Niño Index. When the number is below zero, then waters in the Pacific are below average. When it's above, obviously above average. When we get to above 0.5 on a consistent basis, then that's when we have an El Nino. And typically speaking, El Ninos lead to less activity in the Atlantic hurricane basin, more in the Pacific. The reason for that is actually pretty simple. It's been found that when the waters are downwelling in the Pacific, it creates a more hostile environment with more wind shear in the Atlantic Ocean. If only it were that simple, though. Here is the forecast over the summer from the European, and all of the ensemble members of the European guidance show that an El Nino is going to take shape here this summer, probably sometime in July or August. There is some variance, though, on how intense it could be, and this will actually have more of an impact on what our winter forecast looks like here in the US than maybe our hurricane season forecast. Because like anything else, there tends to be a lag in a big movement in how the actual weather is impacted. There tends to be some time before we see the full effect of this sort of a shift in our global weather pattern take place. So we're transitioning at this point. We're getting into an El Nino, and it looks like from NOAA, a high chance, over 90%, that we do have an El Nino in place here for August, September, and October, our three typically busiest months in the Atlantic hurricane season, about a 93% chance. So I think, it's hard to argue that's not going to be a slam dunk at this point. We're definitely heading towards an El Nino, but I think in the fall and the winters when we see more of an impact in the U.S. and in the Atlantic hurricane basin than maybe now. If the El Nino had come on faster, maybe we would be downtrending on our forecast for Atlantic storms. However, it could certainly still increase. Here's a look at the globe from tropicaltidbits.com. Wonderful website. I encourage you to visit it. It shows some interesting things. We obviously see the warmer waters off of Central America and off of Ecuador and Peru. This actually started taking shape back in the wintertime. It was the precursor to La Nina ending. Now that certainly has increased the warmth back over the Central Pacific. Waters are cooler in the Western Pacific behind our super typhoon, but I think they will warm with time. Now, there's one thing here that is the big variable, and that is what's going on off of California and the Baja. We see below average sea surface temperatures, and these typically counteract what you would see as stronger wind shear in the Atlantic. Let me circle. Actually, I'm going to zoom in and show you guys that in a little bit here. In the Atlantic Ocean, there's some interesting things going on here. We do see the cooler than average temperatures right here off the southeast coast. It's been a cool month of June. Really, May was cool in the southeast as well. That for the shorter term does work in our favor in leading to fewer storms. It doesn't mean we're not going to have any storms. It just doesn't favor stronger storms. Now, this area in here off of the Canary Islands and off of Portugal is running hot for this time of the year. This is what's called the Canary Current. Typically, what it does is it upwells water from the deeper parts of the ocean and brings cooler sea surface temperatures up, and that will go against storm development. Now, these numbers are running a couple degrees above average. These are not the numbers you want to see if you're hoping for a less active hurricane season. Because what's going to happen is when you see above average water temperatures, it's going to continue to heat up the main development region here of the Atlantic, meaning more storms than what you might typically see, because obviously warm water is a huge ingredient in play. So that's what we're watching. The Gulf of Mexico, the Northwest Caribbean, everything is running on the warm side. That's not a shock to me, as we are in a more active Atlantic mode here. Actually, those can last 20 to 40 years. Even with an El Nino, we see above average water temperatures. So we have competing factors in what our seasonal forecast is going to look like based on this. So now we trend forward to the last 7 days. And I'm going to share with you kind of some of the trends that I've seen here. First off, the waters have run cooler than average with respect to what you typically see. This has nothing to do with El Nino. This is all because of the blocking pattern we have over the U.S. that's leading to below average heights and cooler than average temperatures over the U.S. So for the time being, June, I don't think is going to feature a hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico or near the southeast coast. Now it's just June, and we typically don't see a lot of activity in the month of June. So keep that in mind here. You'll also see the Canary Current here has actually warmed with respect to average. This is something that we have to be concerned with in the longer term, as when we see waters warming up like this, that can typically lead to more development in here. I think I just talked about that, but I'm going to repeat that so that you can see what I'm talking about. All right, flash forward here, the Pacific side. Let me show you this here. We have an index called the PMM. It's the Pacific Meridional Mode. And if you want to learn more about that, I encourage you to go to tropicaltidbits.com and watch Dr. Levi Cowan's videos. He'll actually explain that well. But basically, when waters here are cooler than average, the trade winds are not as strong across the Atlantic basin. That would lead to increased wind shear. There's kind of a circulation change where rather than there being stronger than average wind shear with westerlies here killing off activity, we see the opposite when this is the case. So this is unprecedented. Dr. Levi said in his video last night, the only season where he could find something like that occurred was 1951, but 1951 was not a super active, during a super active AMO. And we also did not see the kind of warming in the waters that we've seen across the entire globe here. So we can go back certainly 62 years in history or 72 years in history, but this is really unprecedented to see such a difference in signals here for forecasting our season. And you can see here the analysis shows colder than average temperatures between Hawaii and the Baja, much warmer than average, just an incredible contrast. And really, this is an anomaly pattern that we just haven't really seen before. So a lot of uncertainty going into this seasonal forecast. As we look at the weighted mean of the top 5 seasons that kind of looked like this, this is kind of what you saw. So again, it's a little bit different than the current pattern. You can see, for instance, off of the Ecuador coastline, not a very warm analog that lines up with this. So we really don't have any great history to go off of that really predicts how the season's going to look. But we're going to take a stab at that. According to tropicaltidbits.com, years that had similar analogs were 1975, 2006, 2008, 2010, and 2012. Not super active seasons, but during those seasons where we did have more frequent storms with respect to average are across the east central Gulf of Mexico, with trends typically heading towards the Panhandle or towards the Central Gulf. We also saw a lot of activity here over the northern Caribbean around Cuba, Jamaica, and off of the Belize and Mexico coastline. This does not mean that nothing's going to hit Texas, but it's not as climatologically favored if you go off of those 5 seasons. We also see more active weather off the east coast of Florida, the Carolinas, and New England. More storms coming up in this direction. And we see very busy, with respect to average, storm tracks over the central Atlantic, over the main development region, with a lot of recurving storms as well. So we also see quite a bit more action here off the Mexican coast in the Pacific side of things. So if you look at 5 years that had kind of a similar setup to the oceanic water temperature anomalies, that is how things have differed from average, we see more frequent storms affecting the Western Caribbean, the Central and Eastern Gulf, the Atlantic coastline, and then way out over the Central Atlantic. We see less activity near the Bahamas and South Florida and around Texas and across the eastern parts of the Caribbean and southern parts of the Caribbean. Does this mean this is going to happen again? No, this is kind of an unprecedented setup. So I want to show you this, but I don't want you to focus on it too much. Now, Dr. Cowan talked about the 1951 North Atlantic hurricane season. You can see it wasn't super active for the United States. We had one system over Florida, but we had a lot of intense storms in other places, one affecting Jamaica and the Yucatan, the other affecting areas near and south of Bermuda. But this was 1951, and we don't have the kind of storm tracking methods that we do have now. Hurricane hunters didn't go into as many storms to circulate. We just didn't have all the satellite imagery we have now. So it's very possible there were more storms than what is shown here in the year 1951, more marginal storms. So anyway, very interesting. And over the past 7 days, we have not really seen any warming off of the Eastern Pacific coastline here, actually around the average. Let me circle that so you guys can see it here. Just not a lot of change in here. And if anything, we have a warming trend over here, which I did show you guys. So we're not going to write off the season whatsoever. I think it's going to be pretty active. And I'm going to show you some more methodology, more models behind that. All right, so here is a look from not Tropical Tidbits, weatherbell.com of the sea surface temperature anomaly for this month. And you can see most of the Atlantic is running hot. Okay, now let's look at July and August and September. What do you see here? Well, the areas where storms typically form this time of the year continues to see above average temperatures. A lot of that can be attributed to the Canary Current here, which is feeding in warmer than average temperatures. This obviously does favor more storms because the more fuel you have for storms, the more storms you typically will get. Obviously, wind shear has to come into play here. You can have a lot of hot water and very little storm organization due to strong wind shear. We saw last year where waters were very warm in the La Nina, but nothing happened for most of July and August. That was extremely unusual. And so we had a less active storm season than what you would expect till we got to Hurricane Ian, which hit Florida. So it only really takes one. Here's the seasonal temperature anomaly, and you can see still running 1 to 2 degrees Celsius above average across the Gulf, across the main development region here. Basically everybody running hot due to this Canary Loop current. As we go on further into the fall and into next winter, we can see some cooling happening over time, and we'll see how this plays out into next hurricane season, but maybe we have a lag in that effect. Here's a look at rainfall forecast. Looks like it's going to stay wet this month over the southeast coast, and we see here a very, very, very wet with respect to average Cape Verde season start. So we may not see a lot of organization, but we see a lot of waves coming across Africa here and heading towards the Windward Islands. As we move this forward to July, August, September, we still continue to see what's going to be wetness across the Gulf of Mexico and the northwestern Caribbean. And while August looks like it's going to be dry and hot over the eastern United States, according to this model, as we head to September, there will be ramifications for that. And what it could be is more action here on the East Coast in the month of September. Including Florida, but going all the way up into New England and Atlantic Canada. Below average temperatures or below average precipitation here over the Western Gulf does not favor necessarily storms that can track up into Texas and Louisiana. Typically, this means we have a high pressure region in here aloft, which is going to lead to some sinking air, but that doesn't mean we couldn't get anything. And then by October and November, the models show typically what's going to be more action, and this is not unusual, by the way, more action across the Western Caribbean, less across the Gulf and the Southeast coast. So what this means here is that while June may not be super active, July could certainly be more active in the Eastern Gulf and across the Atlantic wave train region here, the MDR, the main development region. August could be very busy across the Eastern and Central Gulf. And as we get to September, it could be very busy over the Caribbean and the Atlantic coast. As we get to October, we see things very quickly shutting down for the most part. So that's what this model is showing us. Now, looking at the anomalies of the surface pressure, lower pressures than average mean more storminess. And we see very low pressures in the southeast here over the first half of summer. That trend continues on into August and September. We see below average pressure over the central and eastern Gulf and into the southwest Atlantic. So we definitely are seeing some signs of what could be busy activity here as we get through the first half of the storm season. October and November, we see that general trend for below average pressure starting to kind of subside, but it's still there across the Caribbean. And then as we get to the winter time and into early next year with El Nino potentially in full force, we could have a more active storm track and a very wet winter here in the southeast, and probably more winter weather as well for January and February up the East Coast. This definitely favors more storms up the East Coast, and a big flop from what we saw, or a big flip from what we saw last winter, kind of getting paid back for our mild winter in the East. The NMME sea surface temperature anomalies, we can see that, again, the Canary Current is in full force here, July and August. When I say full force, I mean it's feeding into warmer waters, not cooling things, but remaining above average. And we see above average waters continuing here through the winter time. Looking at precipitation from the NMME model from tropicaltidbits.com, very wet here over Florida and over the southeast coast in June. We don't really see much shifting in that in July, other than it's going to still be pretty dry in the Midwest and pretty dry in the high plains, and wetter across Florida and the southeast. As we get to August, we will probably have a heat wave here in the southeast with less storm activity than average. That will, of course, affect us more in September across Florida and the East Coast, where we could see above average precipitation. October still above average. And then November, we look at severe weather season, and we start to look at winter storms over the southeastern United States by the end of the year. A quick look at what we have right now, a very unfavorable pattern here for tropical development in the Gulf. That's not uncommon for early June, but wind shear has picked up. We will see above average storm action here over the central Caribbean, over the southwestern Atlantic. And you can see on the map here, a wave, another wave, another wave, and another wave. And we're just early in the month of June. So above average precipitation coming off of the Cape Verdes here and across the Atlantic. That's what I'll be watching for you guys here in the next couple of weeks. Let me get this off the map here. And let's just take another quick look here at Tropical Storm Arlene. Doesn't look too impressive to you guys, but it does have some stronger winds. Not a threat to land. It's going to weaken here today and become a remnant low near Cuba, and then track over the Florida Straits here later this weekend. That was Tropical Storm Arlene. This was not a tropical storm apparently last weekend at this time. I'm curious to see, though, if that will be looked at again, and maybe we've had 3 storms at this point. Wind shear in the Atlantic, according to the climate forecast system, does not favor as many storms in the northern Gulf, higher than average wind shear. That's shown in the reds. As we get to August, though, that wind shear relaxes and we could have a lot more action across this basin. September, we see lower than average wind shear here in the areas near Cuba and the Bahamas. That obviously is of concern. When we see that, we definitely see a better chance for storms to strengthen quickly closer to Florida and the southeast. They may eventually get to a point where they weaken quicker in September. And then October, we are still looking at what could be favorable amounts of lower than average wind shear over the Caribbean Sea. After October, wind shear picks up here, and we could see a very active southeast storm track by December. I showed you guys that. Here is the seasonal forecast from the European Weather Service Office, and they are predicting a 0.5 standard deviation above average, more than typical storms, despite El Nino coming on. They are showing a 1.4 or 14%, 40% increase in the average accumulated cyclone energy. So they're looking at an active season, 17 tropical storms, the average is 14, and 9 hurricanes, the average is 7. So the European office still says, despite El Nino, we're having an active season. The UK Met office is showing 20 storms. The average is 14, so they're going above average with maybe as much as 26. I do think this is probably going to end up too high, but that's what they're showing. The Colorado State forecast that was just updated is just above the average, pretty much right there in the middle. So despite El Nino, they are still predicting that this hurricane season is going to be active. As the average has come up over the last 30 years, we obviously have a concern with 15 named storms. and the threat for 7 hurricanes and 30 hurricane days. That means 30 days of the Atlantic season will have a hurricane out there. So obviously, they are still predicting above average forecast. Here is my updated forecast. I have taken numbers up: 18 total storms, 8 hurricanes, and 4 major hurricanes. Here are the 4 spots where I think there could be a major hurricane. Again, a very bold forecast, but one that I definitely think could happen. And, last year I predicted more storms than what we ended up having. A lot of that was due to the shutdown here completely in July and August. This year, I think history shows itself and we have a more active season. So, more updates to come, but I really appreciate your time this weekend. If you enjoyed my video, please consider subscribing. I very much appreciate any comments that you have and any questions that you have. And again, my goal is not to scare you guys, but to keep you prepared, as I do think this is going to be an active season despite the El Nino coming on. Next year may be less active, but this year I would be on my toes for an active hurricane season. I want to give all the glory to God, who allows me to do this every single day, who gives me the boldness and the courage to put out a forecast like this. I spent a lot of time here studying the weather. I am a meteorologist. I've done it for over 20 years. I've been a Christian man for 10. And I know that God has called me to do this. Even though science and religion sometimes don't go hand in hand, I've been given the courage and I've been commanded by God to use my gifts to study science and to do my best to share those with you. Joshua 1:9, have not I commanded thee? Be strong and of good courage. Be not afraid, neither be thou dismayed, for the Lord thy God is with thee, whithersoever thou goest. God is here with us. He gives us the courage and the spirit to continue fighting and being bold. And I appreciate that he does that for me. He's given his son, Jesus Christ, to die on the cross to give us eternal life and cleanse us of all of our sins. We can be bold, but obviously we're going to sin. But we are given the courage where if we accept that gift from God through Jesus, we are given eternal life. And I pray for you that you have that spirit of courage as well. And I know the Lord has given us all that gift, and all we have to do is accept it. If you have not accepted it, again, this is not a beat down. This is not, I'm not judging. That's up to God. That's not up to me. But I just encourage you to just spend some time and look at why people follow God and why a lot of us move in joy and in courage. And I want to pray for you if that's your situation as well, even if you're not a person of prayer. Appreciate y'all's prayers, and I hope you have a wonderful weekend. Be ready for Atlantic hurricane season. It's coming. Even though it's off to not a very busy start, I do think we're going to see a very quick ramp up later in July. So I really appreciate y'all's time, and we'll talk again on Monday. God bless you.